Hey folks, in this video I want to give you some information, some tips on how to organize and analyze both quantitative and qualitative data for your projects. We've been so busy this semester learning about techniques for collecting data and then getting into the process of collecting data that when we actually finally have some data that we can work with, it's a little overwhelming. You're like, okay, now what am I supposed to do with all of this stuff? And so that's exactly the point of this video, and to really kind of give us some tips, some practices that we can use for working with this data in the next couple of weeks as we prepare to present and write up our reports for our project. Analyzing data is really an important and key part of the research process, but it's one that's sometimes easy to overlook because of that scramble that we're in to try to get things done. If you remember earlier in the semester when I showed you this chart about the research process, we actually have a square for data analysis on there and some of the techniques we're going to talk about in class, but it comes a little bit later in the process, and obviously it's a key one before we actually communicate our work. So we need to kind of think about how to actually take the data, find some meaning in it, and think about how to represent and report that in our projects. It takes time, it takes effort, and it's one where your team is really going to want to work together in terms of using the skills that are represented in your team. Does somebody have some good experience in terms of quantitative or qualitative data analysis, and can they bring that into the project? And if not, then maybe working with me so that I can help you, give you some advice so you can work forward on getting that data analyzed and reporting it in your project. It's going to be hard for me to cover every single research method, and especially in some depth in this video, so that's really not the point of it, but rather to kind of point you in some directions and give you some general tips and ideas for your analysis stage. But then that's a place where I can follow up with you and give you more advice on how to move forward with specific techniques for analyzing your data. Before we jump into the details about how to do the analysis, I think it's important to emphasize just how much it can really benefit you in doing an analysis to have your data carefully organized. And especially in a project like yours where you have multiple team members, you have an interdisciplinary approach, you have community-based research as part of the method, it's all a little bit more complicated than just one person doing one project, one discipline, and with a relatively straightforward set of data. We have more messy, complex projects. For that reason, I think organization is especially important. So here's some tips for quantitative data. So if you're using any numerical data sets, if you're doing a survey to collect some kind of quantitative responses, if you're using Qualtrics or Google Forms, really your data is kind of captured in those formats themselves, and Qualtrics can spit out the data into formats that are appropriate for analyzing in statistical software packages like SPSS or Stata, others. Google Forms, you can have data exported into a sheet and use that for analysis, either by doing some simple analysis right on the sheet itself or by importing it into one of those programs. And I think that a spreadsheet is a really good way. Spreadsheets are really powerful and flexible, and you can do a lot of stuff with them. You can find things like medians and means and even more complex statistical analyses. Obviously, once you get past a certain level, it's going to be easier to do your analysis in a package. And so if that's something that I can support your team with, let me know, and I'm happy to chat with you in more detail about how to use one of those and the types of analyses that maybe would be helpful for you to use on your data for doing statistical tests, stuff like that we'll talk about on the next slide. For qualitative data like interviews, other forms of content, media content, things like that, maybe some analysis of websites or other information that is relevant for your project. Again, a spreadsheet is a helpful thing to have, not so much to actually keep your data in, but to keep lists and identifiers for the data. I'll show you an example of that in a moment, where you can have columns that indicate different things like the name of the person you interviewed in the case of interview data, the date that you did it, who did the interview, where is it saved, have you done a transcription yet, where's the transcription saved. All those kinds of details are really important things to have. And for each of those, you want to actually be careful that you maintain confidentiality as well. There should only ever be one place where you actually have the names of your participants if you've promised them confidentiality, which we should in most cases, unless there's a reason not to for some research purpose and you've gotten their informed consent about that. But like for interview transcripts and other places, you just want to be cautious that you really are being careful about making sure that you don't have too many records that include the actual name of the participant. And especially for Google Docs, I think anything in the Google Drive world, it's really easy to share those, which is nice. But you also have to be careful that when you're sharing data, you don't actually breach confidentiality of the folks that you're doing research with. So make sure that only the people who should have access to your Google Doc or sheet or whatever are the folks who really do have access to it. And especially for things like transcriptions, you don't actually need to use the name of the person. Like say it's the second interview that you did, just put O2 and that they're going to be research partner O2 as their identity there. And so when you actually are typing out things that they say, don't put their actual name, but just put O2 or some other pseudonym in the actual interview data. So here's an example. This is from the research that Professor Batiste and I have been doing and that I've mentioned a number of times in class. I'll use as an example a few different times in this video, but you can see here's a Google Sheet that has all of our interviews categorized. This is just a portion of it, but you can see the first 15 interviews here, and I've actually used that blue rectangle to block out the names of the participants so that you can't see them, to practice that confidentiality that I was mentioning before. But we've got interview number, date, time, participant, location, interviewer, notes. Is it recorded? What's the status of the recording? Where is it? Is it transcribed? So forth. I didn't even include all the columns on here because it wouldn't fit, but overall, those are the kinds of things that's really good to keep track of, especially, again, you've got multiple people working on this project. It's hard for any one person to remember all the details about these things, so make sure you're consistent and careful about keeping track of your data and organizing it. Finally, one really important point, please, 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 please make sure that you back up your data. Always have backups, whether you're keeping it in Google Drive because it's saved to the cloud there. If you have it shared amongst all the members of your group on your various computers' hard drives, if you use Dropbox, whatever it is, external hard drive, sending it to grandma, whatever, make sure you back up your data. You really don't want to come to me and say, Professor Hankey, we lost our data. We don't know what to do, because I won't really be able to help you. I don't have copies of all your data in most cases. So please, please, please make sure you back up and keep copies of this stuff, because this is what you've been working toward all semester, is getting this information that didn't exist before. So protect it as best you can, and make sure that it's safe from any kind of computer hard drive disaster, stuff like that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about quantitative data, how to do analysis on it, and how to present it in your actual presentation that you're going to give, as well as your paper. For the projects in ENST 390, it's really appropriate to use a lot of descriptive statistics. Descriptive statistics are the kinds of things that are your kind of most basic baby level stats, like giving the mean of the answers that you get from a particular survey question, or giving the median in some cases. And I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about the appropriate places to use those different statistics. But giving means, giving medians, giving percentages, stuff like that are all really important kinds of data that, even though it seems simple and not that complicated in terms of analysis, can actually be really powerful. And I think we have some examples of the studies that we've read in class so far that really demonstrate that, and I'll show in a little bit more what I mean by that, some of the examples. Surveys are not the only place to get that kind of data. You can use census data and other places where you can find data sets online through some of the things that we've talked about in class, like Social Explorer, or some of the more kind of geographic systems like Policy Mapper, stuff like that, that I demonstrated in class a few weeks ago, as well as getting help from research librarians. They know a lot about different data sets that are available and can get you some numbers that you don't have to collect for yourself that exist out there already. That can be really handy, especially as background for certain topics and projects. When you're actually representing your data, percentages are usually better to give than actual frequencies. In other words, if you say ask a question, rather than saying 10 people said this and 5 people said that, give the percentages of the overall sample from your actual survey or from the data set that you're using, because it helps to even out differences in numbers across groups or across populations. The only catch there is you want to be careful about using percentage for a small size of people or whatever unit of analysis that you're using. If you have 10 units of analysis or 10 people, whatever it is, and you say 7 said yes, 3 said no, that's actually a little bit more honest than saying 70% said yes, 30% said no, just because you don't really have that many numbers to really give a percentage. So with small numbers, I would say frequencies are probably a little bit better, but anytime you get higher levels of numbers, a larger sample size, it's okay to use percentages, and that makes sense. The median is actually a good statistic to use, especially anytime we have outliers. If you think about the way income distribution is in the US, we have incomes anything from 0 all the way up to billions and billions of dollars. We in statistics, you call that a long right-hand tail of the distribution. Anytime you have a tail that goes to the right or the left on a distribution of a set of data, that skews the average or the mean. So we want to use the median, which is that middle point, to even that out. So income, other things like that that have data that kind of is pulled in one direction or the other, the median is a little bit better statistic to use because it will help to even out some of those ways in which the mean can be influenced by long right or left-hand tails. We also want to be careful to avoid false precision. So most cases we really only need 1 point past the decimal point. We don't ever want to give usually in this case, in this course, we're never giving multiple points beyond the decimal point of data because we just don't have the need for that level of precision, and it's inappropriate for a lot of the statistics that we're using. And I would say one thing that I've tried to emphasize in class is that quantitative analysis, there's a lot of tools, there's a lot of fancy things you can do, but you don't actually have to be that fancy for community-based research and the types of projects that we're doing here. In some cases, we actually do want to really use powerful statistical tools to do analysis that can benefit a community, like doing some kind of economic impact analysis, or say we were studying the impact of pollution on drinking water. Then we might actually really want to know parts per million or parts per billion. But in a lot of cases, we want to demonstrate things that are not necessarily driven by really powerful statistical methods, but yet at the same time, the numbers really do tell an important story, and sometimes a powerful story. And so, for example, if you think back to the study that we looked at of administrative assistants earlier this semester by those students in 2015, Todaro, Reese, and Kohler, they did a really nice job in their paper of using their survey results in a powerful way that's relatively simple at the same time. So you can see here's one of the responses from their survey where they asked about different initiatives at Colgate and whether the administrative assistants had knowledge about those. In this chart, the green shows people who answered yes, that they did know about it. People who are no are red, and blue is the unsure. So this is actually a relatively simple but at the same time powerful chart that really, I think, effectively conveys the extent to which administrative assistants as important community members on campus either did or did not know about certain sustainability initiatives. And so I think they did a good job of using a relatively basic bar chart here with percentages about these different initiatives. And so I'm not saying that everyone should copy this exact format, but again, it's a good way of kind of showing relatively straightforward percentages about the data that they found. Here's another example where they're asking about how administrative assistants learn learn about sustainability on campus. So again, kind of a focus on knowledge and to what extent people knew about things, how they found out about things. Again, giving percentages, in this case, using a green highlight in the rows for email and for the Green Office program to show what were the most frequent ways that people actually learned about sustainability measures. And then this one's a little bit more complicated, but it's asking, in this case, about behaviors and to what extent the administrative assistants engage in certain sustainability behaviors. They broke up their data into low, moderate, and high behavior actions. So anytime that it seemed like people were, especially on the low end in terms of how often they engaged in this behavior. So you can see recycling K-cups for coffee, unplugging items when leaving for the day to conserve energy. Those are ones that they coded with this red highlight to show that people were less likely to do those. And then all the green ones on the high behavior side on that right-hand column, all the places where they were doing more of that work. So there you go. Those are 3 examples, and you can go back and look at that paper and dig into it a little bit more fully to see some of the ways that they actually used the results of their survey. Again, just showing percentages of responses, but doing it in a format that really effectively and creatively conveys that data and makes it kind of pop out to the reader and supports their analysis. One additional thing to emphasize here about the use of charts like this is that in a paper you don't usually want those types of charts or tables to stand alone. They do convey powerful information and it's effective, but at the same time, you in your text in the paper always want to have at least some narrative where you call out some of what you see as the most significant findings or results, interpretations from the data. So the charts don't usually stand on their own. You always, just about always, want to have some kind of text that explains the chart around the point that you've put it in before moving on to your next point. So those are descriptive statistics. The next level up from that are what we call inferential statistics, where we're trying to show whether or not there's some type of relationship between one or more variables. Sometimes you hear this called bivariate analysis or multivariate analysis because you're trying to figure out whether or not there's some kind of relationship between 2 or more variables. Sometimes you hear this described as testing the null hypothesis. Null hypothesis is kind of a fancy statistics speak for trying to figure out if there's something going on in a relationship or if it's likely to be caused due to chance alone. By convention, in statistics, we say anytime something seems like it could happen based on the rules of probability 5% or more of the time, we say that that's too often that it can be likely due to chance. So we call that the null hypothesis being supported, and we reject the experimental hypothesis that we have that, yeah, maybe there's something going on in this relationship. So there's lots of tools that we can use to do those kinds of tests. Again, it's a little bit beyond the scope of this video, and I'll talk to you in class in more detail about that if you want to use it, especially for those groups who are doing survey research or have some other quantitative data set and they want to figure out, are these relationships really happening? In most cases, we need to have at least 50 cases in our sample for us to do this type of statistical analysis, and even bigger N is usually better. If we can get 100 or more responses in our sample, then we can start to do a little bit more statistical work. Basically, the bottom line rule is the bigger the N, the more reliable our results will be. It's not to say that it's going to be easier to find significant results, but that we'll have a little bit more confidence in the results that we do get if we actually have a larger N, and it allows us to do some more complicated analyses too, especially if we want to start doing analyses on more than one variable through some kind of multiple regression, or if we want to have layers in chi-square analysis. Those are situations when it's better to have a larger N, more data, bigger sample size. The chi-square test is one that you might be familiar with if you've ever taken a stats course. It's a relatively basic level of statistic. It's not super complicated, but it does a good job, especially with data that's we call categorical, where we can put things into categories. So say, for example, we take income and we break it up into brackets. low, medium, and high. And then we have another variable that we want to test and see whether or not income seems to have some impact on a sustainability behavior, like adopting a new heating system in your home to be more energy efficient. Does it seem like there's a relationship between those three levels of income, low, medium, or high, and the yes or no about whether you're willing to adopt that? So that would be a 2x3 table. We've got those categories. We could run a chi-square on that and see whether or not there seems to be a statistically significant relationship between income and your willingness or ability to adopt that technology, that new heating system for your home. There's other ways to do this type of work as well, but a chi-square is a nice, straightforward one that a lot of people are familiar with, and it's easy to perform in a lot of statistical packages. There's even calculators online where you can just plug in numbers into a little table and it'll calculate the chi-square for you. Again, if you look at the study of the administrative assistants done by Tadaro, Reese, and Kohler, you'll see that they actually did some chi-square analyses. I think most of the relationships that they tested were not statistically significant, but that's a finding in itself, right? Even if you don't actually find a statistically significant association between two variables, that still can be meaningful, and it's important to report that in your actual paper if you do that type of analysis. Most projects in ENST 390 don't really go beyond that level to use fancier regression analysis, especially multiple regression. A lot of times we don't actually have the data sets that support that type of work, but it might be appropriate in a situation where you downloaded a data set that has more sample size in it, such as from the census website or another place where you have just a bigger chunk of data to work with. Okay, that's quantitative. Well, how about qualitative work? Qualitative research, we actually often use a process called coding to figure out whether or not there's an association between the different concepts and variables in our data. It's a little bit messier process overall just because qualitative data tends to be messier and a little bit trickier to analyze than quantitative data. It's not to say that it's easy to analyze quantitative data. Obviously, it can be really complex in terms of the tools. What do the interpretations mean sometimes? But overall, qualitative is a little bit trickier in terms of trying to take a set of information, say results from interview, maybe in combination with other types of data, and figuring out what it means. And we can sometimes actually quantify qualitative data. Like, for example, I was saying before, if we had a set of interviews where we asked people a similar question and it turned out that 15 people out of 20 said one thing and 5 said another, maybe we could say that 75% versus 25%. And especially as our number of interviews increase, it becomes a little bit more appropriate for us to actually give a quantitative description of that data. The key method that we use for, as I said before, for analyzing qualitative data is called coding. And one thing to remember is that this is actually not the same as software coding. I was talking to my daughter about this the other day, and she's like, "Oh, I didn't know you knew how to code." She thought I meant like doing software coding. No, it's a different form of coding, same word, but a different process that we use for actually analyzing and trying to make sense of qualitative data. The codes are basically these tags that we apply to chunks of our data that we try to use to point back at the concepts that we started with when we initially conceptualized our research project. So it's a way of kind of trying to place our concepts, place our variables that are part of our research question and our lit review and our conceptualization on the data itself. And I'll talk a little bit more specifically about how to do this in a moment. But it's basically a way that allows us to kind of see the themes, see the results and the details that are emerging from our data as we go through it, and literally kind of like highlighting certain aspects of the data, sometimes literally with colored highlighters or pens on paper, or in the case of more complex qualitative analyses with software tools that help us to do that same work. And one real strong advantage of qualitative research is that it has a lot of flexibility and allows us to see how different themes and results emerge from the data, sometimes in unexpected ways. Sometimes we actually might find things that we didn't expect once we actually start talking to people, say through a set of interviews, and we're like, you know what? I never really thought about this issue that way, but it turns out that a lot of people are expressing it in a particular format qualitative research, and especially this process of coding, starts to allow us to see those patterns emerge, even if they're not originally part of our conceptualization for a research question. So that basically points to two different directions that our coding can happen in, coming in a more deductive way from the theories, the concepts that we started with in our project, and then from a more inductive direction, seeing the patterns that emerge when we actually look at our data and read our interview transcripts or see some other set of data that helps us to start make sense of what's happening there. And those two different directions are where the codes can really come together and help us see what's happening. And the way that we keep track of those patterns is through what we call a coding frame or a coding tree, which is kind of a fancier way of just saying what's our list of key codes that we want to use, that we find useful for organizing and keeping track of the results in our data. And I think the tree metaphor is helpful because if you think about a tree, the main part of the tree is your trunk, right? Then from there you've got branches that go off, bigger branches. And from there, each branch has smaller branches, and you eventually get down to the point where you have these cute little twigs at the end of the branch structure, right? That's kind of what a coding frame or a coding tree is like. You've got your kind of main level codes that are based on your key concepts that you looked at. Then from there, you have subcodes and sub-subcodes and sub-subcodes. And you can kind of think of it like an outline almost, that you've got your kind of main bullet points, and then under each of them, depending on how complex each point is, you might have multiple levels in this kind of hierarchical structure for the codes that you're interested in. That's your coding frame, your coding tree. And again, it kind of is built up from these two different directions. On the one hand, you have your lit review, your theory, your concepts is kind of where you started at, and you can take all the different concepts, the variables, the dimensions, indicators there. It's a good starting point for your actual tree. So think about what's in your research question. What are some of the variables that you really highlighted in the interviews that you, the interview questions that you use to talk to your research partners? Those are all things that are probably going to make the cut for your coding frame. At the same time, they also emerge from the code, from your actual data. So sometimes we call this open coding, and that can involve just reading through the data, seeing what pops out to you and making some notes along the way. Again, maybe taking some colored pens or pencils or highlighters and actually marking up your data. And you can either do that sometimes online, like in a Word document, say, take different colors, a Google Doc, take different colors of highlighting or text and mark them up depending on what you think things stand for, or actually doing it right on paper if you want to print them out. Normally we say in environmental studies we want to conserve paper, but this is a good reason to use paper because there's a really, I think, useful kind of creative way in which your brain is really thinking about the process of making sense of your data by working with it on paper, making notes about it, coloring things in with different highlighters and pens and stuff like that. That can be a really valuable process, especially early in your project where you're just trying to figure out what does this mean. Just, print out some sheets of your interviews and start trying to take some notes and think about it. Talk with your team members and see what's coming together. And so those two directions really are what helps to develop your coding frame or your tree. And that in turn can evolve over the course of the project and the analysis that you're doing. You don't always actually know all of your codes, your key codes from the start of your analysis. They kind of emerge and evolve oftentimes through the process of actually doing the analysis. So you might actually have to go back sometimes and say, oh, you know what? This theme that's emerging now that I've read through 5 interviews seems to be an important trend that I've seen, but I didn't really notice it from the start. So you might have to go back and those first 4 interviews, go back and see if you can find those places again and mark those so that you have a consistent record of the codes that you really want to keep track of from your research. So that all probably sounds a little bit abstract. So again, my go-to is going to be to talk about this food access research project that I did with Professor Batiste. One of the things that we needed to do, we had 50 interviews that we did with partners at the Food Cupboard here in Hamilton, at the market where we did research in Rochester. So think about 50 interviews. That's a lot of data. How do you make sense of that? Well, like I was just saying, we took out a sheet of paper and we actually started trying to map out the coding tree for our research question. I've popped that on the screen here again. What are the cultural and economic factors that either promote or prevent low-income consumers from participating in a locavore diet? So you can see this kind of crazy scratch of different words and arrows and stuff like that that we put in our coding tree. But overall, you can see things like food behaviors like shopping, transportation, budget, the locations where you shop for food, your diet, and what kinds of things you like to make or don't like to make for your food perceptions and belief, how important is local shopping to you, and other things related to that, and then demographic factors as well about who you are and how that matters with these other things. We put down all those top level codes, so you could say the coding tree, those are kind of our main branches. Then underneath them, we have subcodes and in some cases sub-subcodes for all those different elements. So these are the things then we want to go through our interviews and see what we find, what emerges. And we could do this on paper, and for your project that might actually be sensible because you might have a relatively small number of interviews, somewhere between 5 and 10 or 15 at the most, depending on your project, your question, your methods. If you get a more complex project, then sometimes it's handy to be able to go beyond paper and use software packages that help you do coding and analysis of qualitative data. And so we actually use this program called MaxQDA, which is a software package that a lot of qualitative researchers use to do analyses of complex qualitative data sets like the one we have. So this is actually just a screenshot of a file, and getting into this software package here is way beyond the scope of this particular lecture recording. However, I do actually have some other ones if you want to know more about this that I can share with you. So you should let me know about this, whether it's appropriate for your project or maybe you're just curious about it and think you might want to use it in another class. But overall here, you can see we've actually got all these different interviews. This is actually one of the interviews that's on screen, and you can see that it's actually coded with different themes that we have in our coding tree that are kind of these stripes that are coded along the way for the text. Again, I won't be able to get into too much detail here, but you should let me know if you want to know more about this type of qualitative analysis, how to get access to the software, how to use it. I have some resources that I can share with you, and I'm happy to give you a demo of it if your team would like to know more about it as well. Okay, last slide, we need to talk about how to present qualitative data. Just like I showed you those charts from the study of the AAs and how they use some of the statistical information that they had, and especially some of the descriptive statistics, I want to tell you a little bit about how to work with, how to make choices about how to present qualitative data as well. What is a trend in qualitative data? Again, it's a little bit trickier, a little bit more subtle than doing analysis for quantitative data. But overall, it's trying to find the trends, trying to find the patterns, and see what you can present from complex, messy qualitative data. And sometimes it comes down to numbers, really. Like if you're saying most of the people are saying a certain thing, then you know that that's kind of the trend, that's kind of the pattern, and the codes are what helps show you that. If you see that a lot of the people are kind of have this particular color from your coding tree on a question that they answered for you, then you know, okay, well, that seems to be a trend. Maybe I can report on that as one of the findings in the presentation or the paper that we're giving for our project. And so that weight of the data is something you really pay attention to. On the other hand, sometimes there's actually interesting or illuminating exceptions to that that can be helpful to point to as well. So even though maybe you're saying most of the people said this, but you know what, there were a couple people who also said this that was a different trend, it can be kind of useful, honest you might even say, to present both of those trends in terms of what people said and how you describe it, and maybe even giving some example excerpts from your interviews or your other whatever other data you're using to kind of demonstrate some of those examples you see of the trend and some of the exceptions to the rule from your data. Our focus on community-based research in this class means that in some cases we actually do want to really highlight certain responses, certain answers from people, because not necessarily that they help show the trend, but maybe they have some expertise that's really essential for understanding the answer to our research question. So they're not necessarily saying the same thing as everyone else is, but they're important because of their position within a system of decision making, of power, authority, or maybe lack thereof, somebody who's really subject to those systems. So we want to make sure we highlight those voices either because they're especially important or maybe because they're especially marginalized in our community. We want to highlight that in terms of a focus on justice or equity. Then in the end, again, I know I keep going back to the same paper, but I think actually they did a really good job of having a mix of quantitative and qualitative information that they presented on their study of administrative assistants. So let's see a couple more examples, in this case, reporting from some of the interviews that they did with administrative assistants. Here's one where they were saying they were giving some data about why the administrative assistants do things and what are some of the things that motivate them to do sustainable behaviors. And so they said there's kind of two key ways. And one way is that they thought that it was a goal of the university. So there's this first excerpt that they're saying, because I know that's what Colgate wants us to do, I'm trying to be part of that. And then another person who says it's university policy. You can see in each case, they gave an illustrative excerpt from their interview data to show more about what exactly people were saying to kind of justify or explain the reason why they were engaging in these sustainability themed behaviors, because they thought it was important based on what the university wanted them to do. But then they went on and said that other reasons were because they kind of had a personal commitment, or maybe in some cases they felt like they needed to do it for the future or for their family. So you can see this first excerpt here says, I think we all need to work on saving the planet, and it should be everywhere. Then there's another person at the bottom of this box says, I have 2 kids, so it's important to give them a nice and clean earth. Good example of sustainability in terms of trying to make sure that the future has a quality of life and an access to resources that we would want to enjoy in our own lives. So overall, those are some good examples, I think, of how to kind of like take data showing a trend and then give it some examples that show you that trend for the reader in the paper. Again, overall in this video, I've had to kind of give you a relatively broad level of set of tips. So it's been hard for me to be super specific about everything, but I think the key thing to emphasize is here are some tips that are kind of a starting point for you in terms of how to organize, how to analyze, make sense of your data, and then I'll work with each team in more detail about any specific tools or questions that you have. So I hope you let me know about that, and I will see you soon again in class.